Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to first start off by saying that the pandemic has left us, I guess, all really questioning what the supply chain, what APIs and what raw materials, what their real, their importance in terms of producing a resilient supply chain right through from production all the way to actual medicines at the bedside of patients. Clearly very important, but also very opaque part of the industry here. We are lucky today to be joined by a fantastic panel, which I am sure you'll agree will give you some real insights on what it's actually like to be on the front end from an operational point of view, and very much from a strategic point of view on the API challenges. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker. Elisabeth, please, panelists, could you please give a little introduction of yourself, who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hi, my name is Elisabeth Stampa. I am the CEO of Medichem. Medichem is a Spanish family-owned company, and we aim to help our partners have a broad and attractive portfolio of generic drugs. And for that, we do produce APIs and finished dosage forms. The finished dosage form is a little bit the newer part of the business, but we have been in the API business for about almost 50 years. So I think this gives us a very nice insight of how this market and this subsector of the generics works. Happy to be in this panel.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. And now yourself, Gianmario Baccalini.
My name is Gianmario Baccalini. I work in active ingredient field for 50 years. I spent my life in a different company, American and Italian company. I start as usually from R&D activity, and after that I manage as CEO different company around the world. Now I am representing Curia. Curia is a multinational company engaged in active ingredient in biotech with many facilities around the world. Last but not least, I spent 13 years of my life as president of Aschimfarma, representing all the Italian producer of active ingredient. Happy to be here today to participate to very important speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianmario. Over to you, Cathy, please.
Thanks, Aurelio. Hi, everyone. Cathy O'Brien is my name. I am working for UPS Healthcare. UPS, most people will know, is a company who has spent since 1907, so over 100 years working globally on supply chain solutions and transportation solutions. We are a dedicated division, UPS Healthcare. By the name, you will understand that we work with global healthcare companies. Of course, included in that, a very important part of that, are API manufacturers. And we work from clinical right through to commercial. Obviously have been very involved through the pandemic in the challenges facing the healthcare industry, and working on many new solutions, as well as offering our global transportation and supply chain network to support the industry and, go through the challenges that the pandemic has provided to all of us. So delighted to be here, Aurelio and everyone, and really looking forward to the good discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Cathy. And last but not least, if I can just pass over to you, Maurizio.
Thank you, Aurelio. My name is Maurizio Schiavazzi. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Munit. Munit is a worldwide leader in the micronization of APIs. We have two sites. One is Jet Pharma, located in Switzerland, and the other site is Microchem, located in Italy. Both plants are committed to providing excellent services in the particle size reduction. Today, I'm here as a member of the managing committee of the Italian Association CPA, that is the Chemical Pharmaceutical Generic Association.
Thanks, Maurizio. So we've introduced our panelists, and the session is going to be run with three key topic areas that we'll be discussing, followed by Q&A towards the end. So please make sure that you do interact with us. We will try and leave ample time to answer all your questions. The three main topics we're going to be discussing, firstly, is going to be persistent dynamics since the pandemic. So talking about maybe really relatively briefly of what actually happened over the last year and a half, and then moving through any sort of key trends that we feel will actually have knock-on effects throughout the next few years. The next topic is going to be around sustainability, particularly around environmental sustainability and also price sustainability. So making sure that we have a long-term robust industry. And of course, last but not least, is going to be talking around market opportunities. So how can companies such as yourselves in the audience think more strategically about APIs, where it's going, but not necessarily just APIs, also the supply chain around it, maybe around cold chain, where manufacturing is going to be occurring in future, be it Asia, Europe, or the US. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the first topic, persistent dynamics since the pandemic. I'd like to bring Maurizio up to the floor again, please. Again, Maurizio, please, could you just give us a brief introduction, basically, of what's happened over the last year and a half and what you see might be persisting throughout the next few years, especially around topics such as shortages, maybe reshoring, any sort of logistics or bottlenecks. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Aurelio. Yes, one of the dynamics we are facing today is the shortage of APIs, and more specifically, the shortage of intermediates for manufacturing the APIs. Two very quick highlights. First, approximately the 80% of the chemical intermediates used worldwide for the API production are manufactured in China. For example, some antibiotics like cephalosporin or azithromycin are currently predominantly or completely manufactured in China. Second shot, although India is a big manufacturer of APIs, mostly generic APIs, of course, about the 70-80% of the Indian needs of intermediates are manufactured and are coming from China. So the dependence on China is even for the APIs manufactured in India. Now, you can easily imagine the situation of high reliance on China, and this became particularly evident during the last 2 years, during the pandemic period, where a large number of APIs manufacturers were disrupted due to the COVID pandemic, generating, as we know, shortage, sometimes for a long period. And the situation today is persisting. We have seen examples of shortage of microchips, not only of intermediates, or shortage of steel, woods, or cereals like wheat. Let's say one of the consequences of that is the new dynamic you were mentioning, Aurelio, is the reshoring. The shortage of intermediates is pushing Western companies to adopt reshoring initiatives, which, however, I have to say, they put down a list of issues, including planning of investment, minimizing the waste of hazardous chemical, not to mention the long and complex bureaucratic procedures.
Apologies there, I went on mute. Thank you very much, Maurizio, for the brief overview on what's happened over the past year and a half. Now, you've discussed the challenges around the maybe centralization of some key ingredients, and I believe this isn't really any sort of surprise in terms of where some of these APIs are sort of manufactured. Maybe if I can talk a little bit about the supply chain that sort of keeps everything channeled in as well, from maybe some of these areas in India or China, like you said, right through to where the patient actually sits. Maybe if I can move to you, Cathy, just to give us a little bit of an overview from the supply and logistics side of what challenges we have seen and what might be persisting.
Yeah, thanks. So Maurizio has described exactly, some of the key root causes. We talk about the challenges of the centralization and focus on the volume, or let's say the product coming out of China. What we've seen definitely is there's been a huge challenge to capacity that's continued right through 2021, and we expect that to continue. There's some severe capacity issues on ocean and also air. So the air industry still has not completely opened up, as we know. I'll give you a little example. So pre-pandemic, an air charter from APAC into Europe, or even from Europe to the US, was costing approximately $300,000 to $400,000. Today, the industry is demanding $1.3 million for a charter out of Asia into Europe, or from Europe into the US. So that's just some of the impact that may not be seen by everyone in terms of the rising costs. Obviously, simple economics, supply and demand. Obviously, we're also seeing capacity challenges down to the fact that COVID infections are still there. COVID infections rising again here in Europe, and they're definitely impacting some of the availability of resources, such as crew for flights, where we're definitely seeing a squeeze on resource capacity. Obviously, another thing that we all know about is, government policy in many countries, still in Europe, is driving shortages in the labour market. I think it's no secret what we hear Boris Johnson talk about in the UK. We see similar, across France, Germany, Poland, for example, where in Europe alone there's over 400,000 driver shortages. In terms of capacity, if we talk about downstream, Aurelio and all, in terms of that final mile distribution. I think another point I'd like to make is around the exposing of a weakness in how historically pharma manufacturers and the whole pharma supply chain has been managed. It's definitely exposed weaknesses in the whole planning, the visibility and control. So historically and still today, how an actual drug product is manufactured requires huge complexity, complex management. You have the intermediaries, the excipients, you have other raw materials, you have packaging. So you have so many parties and stakeholders in that supply chain, from upstream to downstream, from clinical to commercial. And historically, a lot of the decision making around the supply chain is made in silos. So on the upstream, you'll have some decision making around the clinical research part of the supply chain. You'll have different decision makers and different plans made around the inbound raw materials, and then completely different decision makers and information shared on more of the downstream. So I think definitely what we've seen in the last 18 months is that definitely is driving challenges and opening opportunities. And we'll talk about it a little later in the session, the market opportunities. If we take the COVID vaccine as a great precedent, or let's say an example, of how things maybe can be done differently in the future, I think that's an interesting topic to discuss later on. We can also talk, Aurelio, and then I'll hand over to some of the other panelists. You mentioned cold chain capacity. We've definitely seen that the whole manufacturing structure and the manufacturing capacity is being squeezed, and the cold chain capacity in the supply chain. There was already a squeeze on cold chain capacity because of the fact that biologics and temperature controlled drugs is growing at such a phenomenal rate, and will continue to do so. You add in the cold chain vaccines into an already squeezed manufacturing situation, and that's definitely been a dynamic over the last 18 months in terms of pressures on the global supply chain, and the need for companies like UPS Healthcare to be very agile in standing up extra cold chain capacity to support the API manufacturing process.
Oh, I'm sure. Thank you very much, Cathy, for that. Actually, I'm just going to ask you one short question, and please, just one short answer from yourself as well before we give maybe Elisabeth a chance to voice her opinions as well. Will, there's been a lot of talk potentially about actually going out and reshoring or moving or some of the manufacturing capacity away from central areas. In essence, do you think that there's a balance here between, if we start decentralizing, maybe we'll be adding complexity to the system because we're not, now we know that we can get the raw ingredients from several sites from within the world. And do you believe that that will actually come with a price increase just by the nature of the increased complexity and the geographical variation of manufacturing? And very quickly, do you feel like, that is something that, maybe if we talk to someone like Elisabeth, they're going to have to make difficult decisions about the centralization versus price increases of raw and intermediates?
So, it's a good question. I think it's all about transparency in the whole supply chain. So, I don't believe that, moving from centralized to decentralized or from regionalized or global to more domestic is necessarily a price topic. Certainly from a supply chain perspective, I think that's where we would call on the industry to really, look at the supply chain end to end and look at the value piece of the supply chain. So whilst you may see, of course, for certain movements, you may see some, price increases depending on changes you make. I think, you can look at some savings downstream, for example, in how you're distributing the end product. So I think that's exactly, my point about the, exposing weaknesses in terms of, upfront planning and engaging early with the supply chain, leadership and supply chain stakeholders. You can avoid some of that price impact by, developing efficient supply chains with supply chain partners.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cathy. Okay, so over to you, Elisabeth. We had a clear message there from Cathy that even though you might have price increases on one side, let's take a look at the whole supply chain, because actually overall we might be decreasing the cost to get that medicine to patient. Elisabeth, you as someone who actually has to deal with manufacturing sites in Europe and potentially globally, how do you see the question between centralizing in certain areas in Asia versus Europe, how that might affect your cost base? What's that balance between making sure that we have sustainable medicines for patients?
Thanks. I believe there are 5 different topics which affect the supply chain. One is the different IP situation in the different parts of the world, the environmental requirements, the labor cost, the cost structure of medicines, and the supply chain situation. So both in the US and in Europe, there are different initiatives to reshoring some of the more essential medicines or APIs needed for those essential medicines. But on the other hand, does it make sense to keep those intermediates in one continent when maybe there is a need in another continent. I don't think that decentralizing is the right way of proceeding, because, as Cathy mentioned, there is a lot of working in silos. And as long as we don't have a common supply chain where everyone is transparent, I think it's extremely difficult to manage common sense logistics, which would help to build up the supply chain in the products we need. Call it medical devices, call it APIs, call it finished products. So I think everyone is looking only at their reality. And so there is really no big coordination. If you look at India, there are some incentive schemes since the outbreak of COVID, for enhancing production within India. If you look at Biden 100 days review about vulnerable supply chain, it's only looking into the US, and we have exactly the same in Europe. And in Europe, we have different commissioners from the EU Commission, looking each of them at their piece of the cake. So we do have an industrial strategy on one hand, we do have a chemical sustainability on the other, and then we have a pharmaceutical industry. And not necessarily all three streams of work have the same targets. So if we are not able to coordinate within one single continent, imagine amongst continents where there are so many different situations or so many different conditions to each of them. I don't think it's centralizing or decentralizing is really the solution to the current situation of vulnerability in each of the regions, because each of the regions believes that there is a certain vulnerability. Probably except China, the rest believe there is a vulnerability on the medical, of the supplies of medicines.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And of course, you raise very important points there around the tragedy of the commons, or if we don't all come together in, I guess, a more selfless way, then we can't tackle the problem alone. Now, one of the ways potentially that it could be done is through more flexible regulation that's coordinated between each one of the continents. Now, Elisabeth, obviously this is very much a bit of a pipe dream, having regulation across each one of the countries harmonized right now. But maybe on the topic of regulation, we have within Europe some very large, ambitious projects, EU Green Deal, for example, in 2019, really driving through some changes within the industry, and importantly, through procurement as well, which might affect supply chain as a whole. Maybe Gianmario, I'll hand over to you now, just to give us a little bit, just some talking points, if you will, around environmental sustainability within the industry, potentially water use, how that might be, how that might affect the supply chain going forwards. And then maybe just a little bit more about flexible regulations in terms of actually allowing industry to actually be competitive within Europe.
Thank you. Okay, let me restart from some point that we discussed. It's absolutely clear that the problem of shortage is related to the big change in China, basically related to the situation for many facilities, small facility and medium-sized facility, because they have to respect environmental situation. They now have a clear system that authority are applying to all the producer, and that means that environmental is no more a pending issue, is a real issue. That means all the Chinese must fit the limits that China is imposing. And this is dramatically important because, as you know, there are a lot of facilities in China, small facilities that are engaged in the supply chain because usually Europeans are asking for a key advanced intermediate, but this intermediate is produced in a different facility, not only in one. The the first step are producing in a small facility, the second and the third in another one, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth is produced by the final Chinese selling the material. What means that the environmental problem, the safety problem, and also the cost of manpower change dramatically the situation in China. Now, in the future, what we have to understand is that we need an homogeneous system around the world. This is the famous reason for which 30 years ago all the Europeans decided to stop some production and to fly to China and India asking some intermediate. We start from advanced, after that we ask for early intermediate, and now the situation is that 80% of this intermediate and the starting material are in China. What is the situation is that in China there are important issues: energy, safety, environmental, and cost of manpower. These are changing the level of price that we have to take in consideration. The same history is that we are struggling every day in order to have the same quality system around the world at the same level. And in Asia, this costs new investment because we already are familiar with some really advanced quality methodology, not in Asia. And this means again new investment. The new technology that we have to apply is so different. That means again cost. If we face the problem of cost and we are looking about the problem of regulatory, obviously we appreciate really the tremendous activity that European health authority perform during the lockdown. They give us flexibility. We obtain fast track for important intermediates for COVID problem. And now we are in condition to ask the regulatory system not to have this kind of approach only for a pandemic, but for the further solution of reshoring. What means that we want to respect the quality of the product. Absolutely. We don't want to reduce any level of the very sophisticated system. What we want is to cut the bureaucracy, to cut particularly the time. If I have to change because I am no more available to buy one intermediate in Asia, and I can develop in my R&D a new technology for producing the same intermediate, I have to ask for a change in my DMF. And usually that means 2 years' time is not acceptable. We are losing market. Again, the flexible regulation means a level playing field should be achieved whereby regulatory requirements such environmental, safety, security, supply must be comparable worldwide level. This is the problem. We need to have this activity either for price, either in respect of quality, but we have asked for a more flexible regulation. And this is a very urgent question. Try to be proactive. As we discussed before, in reshoring, we need that all the people, all the active ingredient producer, the final dosage, the intermediate, must understand that we have to accept these changes in the strategic scenario of the medicine. And we want to respect the patient. To do this, we need to approach in a real way the problem of price in China, production of key intermediate in Asia, what we can do realistically in Europe. That means to produce this intermediate only with new technology in a more flexible regulatory system, in full respect of the quality, but with the willing that we want to be approved in a very serious and quick way. What means apply informatic reuse, try to be very efficient, try to be homogeneous, try to have an
Mhm.
approval in FDA that could be useful for European authorities. And again, when I have to overcome all the inspection from Brazil, Korea, FDA, Europe, something is wrong. I spending a lot of money, but my quality system, if was approved in Europe and in FDA, I think that is enough. We needed to be more efficient in a serious way.
Thank you, Gian Mario. Now, you've raised a lot of very important and you've given some strong messages there. So, firstly, I just want to also point out that, China is making large steps towards trying to reform their energy sources. They are one of the highest investors in green energy. From what I understand, is that they also are reforming their policies, their regulations continuously as well, and in many cases are actually starting to move quicker than Europe in terms of regulatory concerns. So maybe, Elisabeth, if I could just quickly bounce back to you, if we get everything that Gian Mario asks for within Europe, flexible regulations, harmonizations with other key markets such as the FDA, talking about investments into efficiency. How long do we really have before China or other Southeast Asian nations actually start to reform and become competitive in a green and resilient way as well? Is this a risk that we'll encounter further down the road?
I guess so. I believe we will have competition coming out from Southeast Asia with cleaner technologies, probably quicker than we are moving in Europe. Mm-hmm. Compared to other continents in Europe, we are much slower because we want to have encompass all different opinions and not hurt anyone and have a very global view. But we are starting many initiatives without really having a clear guideline. And we are talking about reshoring, but who is going to invest in Europe if there are many restrictions about products you cannot produce? If tenders are still driving the prices of the finished products down, so this immediately means the API has to go down on price again. If there are some products we really cannot produce in Europe because of environmental issues. So I think if we do not act quick and we do not act now, it will be too late because our competitors in other continents will be probably having higher standards at a much cheaper price than what we will have. And if not, look at batteries. I mean, 5 years ago, they were extremely expensive and the price is going down and down and down. And the same will happen with newer technologies. If we don't lead that path.
Again, with batteries, we see Southeast Asia again becoming one of the key players. Thanks, Elisabeth. So maybe back to Maurizio.
Oh, sorry, Aurelio. If I
Go
could
ahead.
just come in here, because just from Elisabeth, and we've heard from Elisabeth and Giancarlo on some of the challenges. I think from the production side, definitely I would echo what we see from a supply chain side, transport side. As UPS, we've put forward a very bold commitment, which is to be carbon neutral by 2050, and we're on the way with that. So it's a bold it's a bold commitment, but achievable. And we aim to have by 2025 40% of our ground operations on alternative fuel, 50% reduction in CO2 per small parcel by 2035, and some other objectives. And definitely what we see and what I see from a pharma and API manufacturing perspective, if you talk about procurement, which I think a few people have mentioned, whilst sustainability and environmental topics are part of some of the procurement qualitative topics that we talk about with pharma, when it comes to decision making, rarely do we see really sustainability being part of the decision making fundamentals, and it will be nice to see that change, where all the stakeholders in the decision making process are accountable for bringing sustainability into the decision making, and making that a much more important factor as we go forward around the supply chain elements.
Thank you. Very important points, and I'm glad that your companies put forward some very ambitious targets to also meet targets from the Paris Agreement. So, Maurizio, just taking on board some of the conversations that we had there, and I'm just conscious on time, I want to push this through to looking at market opportunities, because we've talked about the challenges here. What actually would you see in terms of going forwards in the API space, areas where maybe Europe are going to become more competitive, maybe not looking at a volume play, but potentially looking at it from a value play? Could we maybe talk about biosimilars or complex generics, antibody drug conjugates, for example? Over to you. What are your views?
Yeah, thanks, Aurelio. What we see is that biosimilars and high potent API are expected to grow very rapidly. Very rapidly at a growth rate much higher than the global average. And this is the expectation in the next years. Another so-called emerging therapy is the antibody drug conjugates, the ADCs. And yeah, we expect this to grow rapidly, but at the moment this is, let's say, an emerging but niche market. In fact, the most part of the high potency drug substances will be manufactured by chemical synthesis. So the ADCs, the antibody drug conjugates, will be only a minor part. I would like to stress also another evident trend in the market, and that's the rise of the orphan drugs market. The percentage of orphan drugs approvals compared to the total almost doubled in the next 6 years. And last, I would like also to mention that small molecules productions have pushed and are pushing today the manufacturers to face some challenges. For example, some investments are needed to handle high potency drug substance. The high potency are usually low volumes drugs, but they require high containment systems. And usually the investment for equipping the company with a highly contained system is not peanuts. But as you know, this is the trend of the market. The safety of the environment, the safety of the personnel, and the safety of the drug substances.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. Now, we've heard a little bit about some of the complex areas that might be coming in. Increasing API from a value perspective, and I see a few questions actually really talking about that specific topic actually coming in. So, Maurizio, thank you for that. That may have answered some questions there. On the question of orphans, I think the one thing that we say here within our team is that collectively rare diseases are not necessarily rare. So 6% of European patients are thought to have some rare diseases. So high value areas where we can actually bring about greater services to actually some of these patients, whether it's increasing the amount of medicines that they take in the home care setting rather than in a clinic or in a hospital, such that we've seen through the pandemic. These services, standard services, are growing quite a lot, and I'm sure, Cathy, you might have something to say around those additional services from a logistical point of view. But before we sort of jump into any more questions or so on, there is just room right now to just quickly go between you each one at a time to just give us a little bit of a message, and no more than about 30 seconds or so, what you feel should be concrete calls of action to the industry. And that could be any stakeholders from regulatory to payers, down to other, your peers, other API manufacturers, for example, or logistic companies. What sort of calls to action would you say are going to be very important for the audience to think of when they look at the API market next year and beyond? So quite a little bit of a challenging ask, but maybe, Elisabeth, if I can start with you, no more than about 30 seconds to a minute. Please, could you give us your, closing thoughts before we go into Q&A?
Sure. What I would ask for, if we really want to reshore the API industry and I stress the and keep the existing API industry in Europe, which is mainly concentrated in Spain and Italy and a little bit scattered in the other countries, I think that we need flexible regulation. I think we need incentives to retain talent, to attract new technologies, and to attract investment. And clearly, clear guidelines are what any investor would need in any sector, whether it is, car industry or our industry. So what we need is clarity, straightforward rules, flexibility, and really have the final target, which is to attract and keep existing industry, and not forget about that target during the long negotiations.
Thank you. So very good messaging there. Gian Mario, if I can hand over to you, 30 seconds to a minute, please. What are your key messages and closing thoughts?
I fully agree with the message of Elisabeth. She touched the basic point. Let me add something. For solving in a realistic way the problem for active ingredient producer, we need to invest in new technology. To do this, we need that all the authorities are flexible for regulatory, but open to speed up the investment, because we can produce some basic material and intermediate in a different way. But we need to do this with the formal first approval from regulatory and for the market, because I can improve the quality of my active ingredient using new technology for intermediate. But I need to be careful about the time and what could be the reaction of the homogeneous quality system. Another important thing, please, we cannot have one evaluation in Europe a different evaluation in Asia and sometimes different evaluation in US. Europe till now is the more difficult part of the world for producing active ingredient. We have a very heavy system, either for innovation, either for the approval.
Thank you, Gian Mario. Very clear. If I'd like to just move on to yourself, Cathy. 32
Yeah,
minutes.
so for me, really the call to action from my side on behalf of UPS Healthcare would be for the industry to take a much more transparent, full end-to-end supply chain integration approach. We talked earlier about the silos and some of the complexity is pretty straightforward to remove. In terms of what Elisabeth and Giancarlo have talked about, of course, the regulations, etc., that's a big challenge for the industry. But there are opportunities to reduce complexity by working with, for example, one global partner or a company that can help right through clinical to commercial, looking at the quality management system you talked about. So that would really be my call to action. Engage the supply chain partners and logistics companies much earlier in the supply chain discussions, and we can help with removing some of the straightforward complexity and then let the industry focus on some of the more challenging pieces of the puzzle, which my colleagues have just talked about.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cathy. Also very clear. Now, we started off the session with Maurizio. We're going to close off the session with you again, Maurizio. Please, some strong calls to action from yourself. You have
Thank you, Aurelio. I'm fully in agreement with the panelists for what we discussed. Let me add one small thing based on my experience in the API field. I think that today even more than in the past, Western companies hold the technical know-how and the capabilities to increase their APIs production and sales. But of course, something more is needed, as the panelists clearly mentioned, such as harmonization of the procedures, innovative technologies, such as Industry 4.0. We talk of industrial robotization and automation, artificial intelligence, the micro reactor technology. These, I think, are the main tools of the chemical synthesis of the future and of the green chemistry of the future.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. That was very clear. So I would just like to jump on to some Q&A. We have just under 10 minutes to do so. Now, we've received quite a lot of good questions from yourselves. I'm going to maybe start talking about some that are, here we go, talking about sustainability. One of the questions I've had is regarding sustainability. Once we reduce the use of oil for the generation of energy, is there an alternative way of getting derivatives that are nowadays obtained from oil, and which are critical for manufacturing raw materials? So that's actually a very difficult question, but who would like to maybe take a stab at that? I think, potentially the broader question is, can we move away from oil in the areas that really rely on them for the actual raw materials? We're not talking about logistics or transport here. We're talking about some raw materials that are derived from oil, of which we know many chemicals are. So is there some alternatives now? Top of my head, I can maybe think of things like biomass or different sources. So would anyone like to take a stab of that?
Yeah, I can do it. I believe
Thank you, Elisabeth.
there are alternatives for sure, but alternatives and complying with what everyone is requiring will cost money. So the big question in all this supply chain is gonna pay for the new technologies, for the alternative energy sources, for the investments, because I have the feeling that we are sort of shifting the cost issue from one player to the other, and no one wants to accept that having greener or newer technologies will cost money. And I don't know, I mean, probably in other countries in Europe as well, but if you want products which have a bio stamp or a bio certification, cost much more money than if you want whatever apples. If you want the bio one, you pay a little bit more. So the question here is, who is prepared to pay for that extra cost of producing with alternative energies or with greener technologies?
Elisabeth, I think you've gotten right down to the core of this issue, and someone else has also asked a very similar question here. They've asked, how can we remain sustainable if API prices keep going down? Now, it might be possible in certain cases, but it's very difficult to consider reshoring as a general policy. And I'm adding this part as well, potentially moving towards new sources of production, greener technology, maybe greener chemistry right from the very beginning. So there is definitely a question about the costs of this. Maybe Elisabeth, just very quickly going back to you, since you've been quite vocal on this. Is this now up to the payers? Are we now saying, okay, look, we kind of know what we need to do. We need the incentives, but really we're starting to talk about tenders and the payers. Now it's time for you to actually drive change right from the beginning. Is that what we're talking about here? Over to you.
I think what we're talking about is the inconsistency between the final target and the willingness to pay for it. The authorities want products, pharmaceutical products, produced with green technologies, innovative, attracting or creating employment, but at a very cheap price. So if the cost of one API is below $10 per kg, who is gonna invest in producing that API at a cheaper price? Does it have to be the API manufacturer? Because that's basically the reason why producing APIs, high volume, low profit APIs, went to China. And if we don't want to face it, it's fine. But the reality is that we outsource to China the dirty and cheap production of some of the key APIs and key starting materials.
Very good. Thank you very much. Some quite tough questions there, or quite tough realities there. At the end of the day, some thoughts from myself is that we do have to invest in that technology to drive greater transparency and to be able to hold some of these stakeholders accountable. And I think transparency is going to be able to do that, because once we start talking about price, really we can't decouple the question about price and also access of medicines for patients. So if authorities are trying to drive greener, more resilient supply chains, and the price is going to be an inevitable conclusion of that, really we have to accept that that might come at a cost of potentially, not necessarily, or decreasing access to medicines for patients. So I'm not saying that it will, and I don't want to necessarily go down that rabbit hole, but it's something that we have to potentially make sure that, we make that calculation in many areas within healthcare. We should make sure that we make it with regards to increasing supply chain resilience and sustainability. Okay, so I have potentially a question here for yourself, Cathy. I've noticed that Maurizio's frozen there, but Cathy, so we talked here about cold chain, and going forwards, Maurizio himself was talking a little bit about new technologies coming out there, whether it's biosimilars or looking further ahead, mRNA vaccines for oncology, for example. that requirement for cold chain could be a way for European companies to differentiate themselves and to actually be able to serve patients much better. Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about how companies such as yourself, logistics, could potentially partner with manufacturing companies and help them grow over the coming years?
Absolutely. Yes, so I mean, we definitely, as UPS, we usually map out our investments at least 5 to 7 years ahead. So we're constantly looking at the trends in the industry, particularly in healthcare, where things are changing. Lots of innovations coming around cold chain management. So really, from our perspective, we are looking at, as I've mentioned a few times, the whole supply chain. And from a temperature control logistics perspective, it's really around supporting, the active technology that's on the market and making sure that we have quality systems in place to ensure that, we are, managing to the regulations that are in place around temperature control distribution. And that's what we've done. If we look at the last 18 months, obviously it required rapid investment from companies like UPS Healthcare, where we've invested, in retrofitting our existing several of our existing 125 GDP GMP locations globally. So adding cold chain capacity like -20, -40, and even freezer farms down to -80 for some of the vaccines. And then, of course, there is, ensuring that we have access to temperature controlled visibility in terms of the technology that we adapt, and making sure that we've implemented global technology for visibility and management of the cold chain. So I think from a supply chain perspective, definitely over the coming years, cold chain management, quality management of the cold chain, and quick access to cold chain capacity is going to be needed. And, we've stood up a dedicated healthcare division to allow for speed of decision making, to allow for quick, agile investment in those type of capabilities. So happy to say, May of this year, we've announced a dedicated subdivision of UPS Healthcare only looking at the cold chain technology and cold chain
solutions. Please, Cathy. Yeah. Thank you, Cathy. Sorry to stop you short there. I'd just like some closing messages in the last minute or so. So again, I hope everyone has enjoyed it and has learned something. From myself, I'd just like to just point out some of the key points. We talked about increasing supply chain transparency, bringing in a holistic view of the supply chain and how decisions are made. So let's not keep these silos. The coordination amongst different nations is difficult, so let's bring in flexible regulations that are harmonized across different continents. And let's start talking about sustainability right from the word go, bring in all stakeholders and make them accountable. So thank you very much for that session. I hope everyone's found it illuminating. And now I would just like to pass over to yourself, Diana, for some closing thoughts. Thank you, everyone.